There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with tears or with the sound of a door closing. It does not come dressed in black at a funeral, where at least the world acknowledges that something has been lost. No, this kind of loneliness is quieter than that, more patient. It settles into the bones the way cold settles into old timber, slowly, without drama, until one morning you wake up and realize the chill has been there so long, you stop noticing it. Clara DeVane knew that loneliness the way she knew the smell of pine resin after rain, the way she knew the exact creak of the third porch step, the way she knew, without looking, which direction the Sierra Nevada peaks would glow when the sun dropped low enough to turn them the color of an old wound. She had known it since she was 19 years old, since the morning she stood at the edge of a freshly turned grave and realized that the one person in this world who had ever truly seen her, not the land she owned, not the stubborn set of her jaw, not the fact that she could ride and rope and negotiate a harvest contract with any man in Sacramento County, but her, Clara, the girl underneath all of it, was gone. Her father, Seamus DeVane, died on a Tuesday in March of 1868. He did not die dramatically. There was no stampede, no gunfight, no flood swallowing the valley. He simply worked himself past the point a body can return from, the way Irish immigrant farmers of that era tended to do, quietly, without complaint, as though rest was something shameful. He died in his own bed with dirt still under his fingernails, and a ledger of debts on the nightstand, and his daughter's hand in his. His last words to Clara were not about the land. They were not about the debt. He looked at her in that dim morning light, with the Sierra peaks just beginning to catch the first orange of sunrise through the window behind her, and he said, "The mountain's still watching, Clara girl, and so am I." She did not cry at the funeral. She had learned that from him too. What Seamus DeVane left his daughter was not what most people would call an inheritance. He left her 43 acres of Sacramento Valley farmland with a lien against it that would take 5 years of perfect harvest to clear. He left her a mule named Absalom, who had strong opinions about strangers. He left her a house with a roof that needed replacing and a reputation in the county as a man who kept his word even when it cost him. That last part, the reputation, turned out to be worth more than the acreage, because in the 5 years that followed, Clara DeVane did something that the men of Sacramento County could not quite reconcile with the image they had constructed of a young woman alone on a farm. She survived. Not just survived, she negotiated. She built. She paid back every cent of that lien 18 months ahead of schedule. And when the final payment cleared, she walked out of the land office on J Street, stood in the California sun, and felt absolutely nothing, which was when she understood that something had gone wrong inside her. Not with the farm. The farm was fine. With her. She had spent 5 years so focused on not losing what her father built that she had forgotten to build anything of her own. She had turned down 2 proposals. One from a decent enough man named Hargrove, who smelled of saddle leather and had kind eyes, but nothing behind them, and one from a land speculator named Croft, who had plenty behind his eyes, but none of it she trusted. She had said no to both and felt nothing about either decision. And now here she was, 24 years old, solvent, alone, and standing on a street in Sacramento wondering what exactly she had been working so hard to protect. The farm felt different after that, smaller, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Her neighbor, an older widow named Mrs. Falk, who grew tomatoes and had no filter whatsoever, I told her plainly one Sunday after church, Clara DeVane, you are going to work yourself into the same grave as your father and call it living. Clara told her that was none of her business. Mrs. Falk told her she was right, and said it anyway. It was Mrs. Falk, of all people, who first mentioned Redwood Flats, a small settlement, 2 days north and west of Sacramento, tucked into the foothills where the valley gave way to timber country. A town, if you could call it that, built around a sawmill and a trading post, and a handful of families who had come looking for something quieter than the city and wilder than the valley. Land was cheap there, cheap enough that Clara, with the money from the lien payoff, could buy a second parcel outright, something with timber rights and a creek running through it, and start something genuinely new. Or, Mrs. Falk said, refilling Clara's coffee without asking, you can stay here and keep being the saddest solvent woman in Sacramento County. Clara did not respond to that, but 3 weeks later, she loaded Absalom, packed everything that mattered into 2 trunks and a canvas roll, and pointed herself north toward Redwood Flats. She told herself it was a business decision. She told herself that the whole way there. The road north was 2 days of Douglas fir and red dirt, and the kind of silence that asks you questions you are not ready to answer. Clara rode it straight-backed and deliberate, the way her father had taught her to ride. Like you belong wherever you're going, and even when you don't. She did not know, on that road, that Redwood Flats was about to hand her something she had stopped believing existed. She did not know that a man named Elias Ward had arrived in the settlement 4 days before her, carrying a leather satchel, a story that didn't quite hold together, and eyes that had clearly seen more of the world than a cattle broker's had any business seeing. She did not know any of it. She just rode, and somewhere above her, through the cathedral break of the redwoods, the Sierra peaks behind her caught the last of the afternoon light and turned the color of an old wound. The mountain was still watching. So before we go any further, I want to know where you are watching this from. Drop your city and your country in the comments right now, and let's see how far the Redwood Chronicle reaches. Redwood Flats was not what Clara had imagined. She had imagined rough. She had prepared for rough. 5 years of managing a Sacramento Valley farm alone had calibrated her expectations accordingly. She was not the kind of woman who arrived anywhere expecting to be pleasantly surprised. Surprise, in her experience, was rarely pleasant. Surprise was a lien you did not know existed. Surprise was a roof giving way in February. Surprise was your father's hand going still in yours on a Tuesday morning when you had fully expected him to make it to Wednesday. So she had not expected Redwood Flats to be beautiful, but it was. Not in any way that would make a painter stop his horse. Not grand or dramatic. It was beautiful the way useful things are beautiful. A well-balanced axe head, or a tight-jointed fence line. A creek that runs exactly where you need it to. The settlement sat in a natural clearing where the timber broke and the light came through in long afternoon columns. The kind of light that made everything it touched look like it was worth something. The sawmill sat at the north end of the main road, a low building with a broad yard stacked with fresh-cut timber that smelled so clean it almost hurt. Around it, maybe 30 structures, some proper buildings, some little more than good intentions dressed in lumber, arranged themselves along 2 intersecting dirt roads with the confidence of a town that intended to become something. Clara pulled Absalom to a stop at the edge of the clearing and sat there a moment, taking inventory the way her father had taught her to read new land. Our water. The creek she could already hear to the east. Good. Timber. Obviously. Good. People. A woman hanging washing outside a cabin near the mill. 2 men moving lumber in the yard, a child chasing something small and fast near the trading post. Small population. Everyone would know her business before she knew theirs. Less good, but manageable. She clicked her tongue, and Absalom moved forward, still suspicious of everything, as was his custom. The trading post was run by a man named Gideon Marsh, who was approximately 60 years old, shaped like a barrel that had survived several hard winters, and possessed of the particular gift that certain people in small settlements develop: the ability to know everything about everyone without appearing to pay attention to anyone. And he was sweeping his front step when Clara tied Absalom to the post outside, and he did not look up, but she had the distinct impression that he had catalogued her entirely in the half-second before she dismounted. "You'll be the DeVane woman," he said, still sweeping. "I will," Clara said. "Is that already settled?" Mrs. Falk sent a letter ahead, said to expect a stubborn Irish girl with a good mule and no patience for nonsense. She's not wrong about the mule. Gideon Marsh stopped sweeping and looked at her then, and whatever he found in her face appeared to satisfy some internal assessment, because he nodded once. The kind of nod that in a small settlement means more than it looks like, and held the door open. "Come on in then, I'll show you what Falk arranged." What Mrs. Falk had arranged, and through some combination of correspondence and the particular authority that widows of a certain age exercise over everyone around them without anyone quite understanding how, was a cabin at the south end of the settlement's eastern road. It was not large. It was sound. The roof was good. The floor was level. And a previous occupant had built a stone fireplace with a kind of careful attention that told Clara something important about the kind of people who had come to Redwood Flats. People who built fireplaces like that were people who intended to stay. She stood in the center of the single main room and turned slowly, reading it the way she read new land. It would do, more than do, if she was honest. But she was not in the habit of being more than necessary about things that pleased her. That too, as she had learned from Elias DeVane, who had never once in his life said a meal was excellent when good would cover it. She set her canvas roll on the floor, sat on it, and listened to the settlement outside. The mill was running, a low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. Somewhere nearby, that child was still in pursuit of whatever small creature had taken its attention. A horse nickered. Someone laughed. A man's laugh, low and unhurried. The laugh of someone who found something genuinely funny, rather than the performing kind. Clara noticed the laugh without meaning to. She filed it away without knowing why. She met most of Redwood Flats that first evening, the way you meet a small settlement, through Gideon Marsh, who appeared to function as the town's operating system, and he brought her to supper at the home of the Aldridge family, who ran the mill and had apparently taken it upon themselves to feed every new arrival until they were settled enough to feed themselves. Margaret Aldridge was a broad-shouldered woman from Ohio, who cooked like feeding people was a moral position, and her husband Cal spoke in the slow, considered way of a man who had learned that most things said quickly could have been said better slowly. There were 6 other people at that table. Clara learned their names, their histories, their grievances with the county land office, and their opinions on the sawmill's current output in the span of a single meal, because that is what small settlement suppers are. An efficient transfer of everything a community needs a newcomer to know, and delivered through the medium of pot roast and cornbread. She was good at this, listening without appearing to listen, storing information without appearing to collect it. Her father had been the same way. God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, Clara girl, and the ratio was not accidental. What she noticed quietly was the empty chair at the far end of the table. She did not ask about it, but Margaret Aldridge, who missed nothing, caught her noticing. "That's Mr. Ward's usual seat," she said, refilling Clara's coffee with the authority of a woman who had decided Clara needed more coffee, whether she knew it or not. "Cattle broker. He boards with us. Out on the Heller property tonight, looking at stock." Clara said. "Good man," Cal Aldridge said. In the slow way he said everything. "Quiet. Ike knows his business." "Knows something," Gideon Marsh said, from the end of the table, and then said nothing more, in the way of a man who has made a point and is content to let it work on its own. Clara looked at the empty chair a moment longer than she meant to. Then she looked away. She walked back to her cabin alone after supper. In the last of the evening light, the settlement settling into its nighttime sounds around her. The mill had gone quiet. The creek was audible now from here, which she had not noticed in the afternoon noise. She stood on her new porch and looked west, past the tree line, towards where the sky still held a thin line of copper at the horizon. The Sierra Peaks were behind her now, too far to see, but the sky above the redwoods was doing something she had not expected. The first stars were coming through in the east, sharp and deliberate, the way stars come through in high country, where the air has less to hide them. Her mother had believed in signs. Her father had believed in work. Clara had always considered herself more her father's daughter in that regard. But she stood on that porch a long moment, looking up. And without entirely meaning to, she thought, the mountains still watching. And for the first time in longer than she could honestly account for, that thought did not feel like grief. It felt like something else. She did not have a name for it yet. She went inside and did not think about the empty chair. She tried anyway. She met him at the creek, not by design. Clara DeVane did not arrange encounters, and she did not position herself in doorways or linger at trading post counters, hoping someone interesting would walk through. She had watched women do that in Sacramento. The careful casualness of it, the studied nonchalance, and had always found it faintly exhausting. If something was going to happen, it would happen. If it wasn't, no amount of strategic loitering would change that. So she was at the creek because she needed water. That was all. It was early, the kind of early that belongs exclusively to people who grew up on farms, the hour before the settlement fully woke, when the light was still thin and silver, and the air had not yet committed to the day's temperature. She had a wooden bucket and a practical expression, and absolutely no expectation of company. He was crouched at the water's edge, maybe 30 feet upstream, perfectly still, watching the current. Not fishing, no line, no net, just watching the water move. Clara stopped. She was not sure why she stopped. She had seen men do stranger things, but there was something about the quality of his stillness that caught her. Not the stillness of a man resting or a man distracted, but the stillness of a man thinking very hard about something that had nothing to do with the creek in front of him. Using the water the way some people use fire, as a surface to think against. She recognized that. She had done it herself, at the creek on her father's land, more times than she could count. She did not announce herself. She simply moved to the water's edge, set her bucket in the current, and waited for it to fill. He turned at the sound. Elias Ward was not what she had assembled in her mind from the previous night's table conversation. She was not sure what she had assembled exactly. Some composite of the words cattle broker and quiet and knows something. But it had not produced this. He was perhaps 30, or near enough that the difference didn't matter. Not tall in any dramatic way, but built with the kind of economy that suggested he had spent serious time doing physical work at some point in his life, even if whatever he was doing now did not require it. His face was the kind that took a moment to read, not because it was closed exactly, but because it was still, composed in the way of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, to be careful about what he let show and when. His eyes, though, his eyes were paying attention in a way that was difficult to account for in a man who had supposedly just been watching a creek. He looked at her for one full second, the kind of look that is actually an assessment, dressed as a glance. And then he said, very evenly, "You'll be the DeVane woman." Clara felt a small flicker of something that might have been amusement. "That's the second time someone said that to me since I arrived," she said. "I'm starting to wonder if Mrs. Falk sent a telegraph to every soul in the settlement." "Just a letter," he said, "but she writes thoroughly." "She does everything thoroughly," Clara said. "It's her most exhausting quality." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The weather preceding a smile, maybe. "Elias Ward," he said, and did not offer his hand across the distance, which she noted. Not rudeness, the opposite. He was reading the room, or in this case, the creek bank, and had correctly assessed that she was not a woman who wanted her hand taken by a stranger at 6 in the morning. "I know," she said. "You had the empty chair." A pause, brief but present. "I did," he said. They did not have a conversation so much as an exchange, the kind of careful, lateral communication that two self-contained people conduct when they are interested in each other and unwilling to admit it even to themselves. She asked about the Heller property, the cattle he had been assessing. He answered in the specific, knowledgeable way of a man who genuinely understood livestock, which she noted, and then asked about her land parcel, what she intended for it, or whether she planned to farm or timber or both. She told him. More than she had intended to, actually. That was the first thing that unsettled her. Clara DeVane did not, as a rule, tell people her plans before they were made. Plans shared too early became other people's opinions, and she had no use for opinions on things she had already decided. But something about the way he asked, not with the proprietary curiosity of the Sacramento men, who had wanted to know her business because they thought it might become their business, but with the straightforward interest of someone who simply wanted to understand what she was building, loosened something she had not intended to loosen. She caught it after maybe 4 sentences and pulled back, the way you pull back a rein. He noticed. She could tell he noticed because he did not push, did not ask the follow-up question that would have been natural. He simply let the conversation settle where she had set it down and looked back at the creek for a moment. "Good water," he said. "Creek runs year-round. Doesn't dry up in August the way the valley creeks do. You've been here long enough to know that." "I've been here long enough to ask," he said. Clara considered that. "That's a useful distinction," she said. "Most important things are learned that way," he said. "Asking the right people, the right questions." She picked up her bucket. Full now. "And what are the right questions, Mr. Ward?" He looked at her then, directly, without the careful lateral angle of the previous few minutes. And for just a moment, the composed stillness of his face shifted into something that she could not quite name, not warmth exactly. Something more honest than warmth. The expression of a man who was thinking something true and deciding whether to say it. He decided against it. "Still working that out," he said. And the almost smile came back, quiet and unhurried. Clara picked up her bucket and turned back toward the settlement. She walked 12 steps before she realized she had not told him good morning, which was not like her. She was scrupulously polite, as a rule. Her father had raised her that way. She thought about turning back to correct the omission. She did not. She set the bucket on her cabin floor and stood in her doorway, looking out at the creek path for longer than the moment deserved. And the thing that bothered her, and she identified it precisely because she was the kind of woman who preferred to locate discomfort rather than avoid it, was not what he had said. It was the question he had not answered. In her experience, men who were asked a direct question and chose not to answer it fell into two categories. The first were men who did not have an answer, which was common enough. The second were men who had an answer and had decided, for reasons of their own, that the moment was not right for it. Elias Ward did not strike her as the kind of man who didn't have answers, which meant he was the second kind. And the second kind, in her experience, were either the most trustworthy men you would ever meet, or the least. She had not yet determined which. She told herself she was not particularly invested in finding out. She almost believed it. That afternoon, she walked her land parcel for the first time. The 40 acres of timber and creek frontage she had purchased through correspondence, sight unseen, the way you sometimes have to bet on things when you are building from nothing. She walked every foot of it, the way her father had taught her to walk new land, slowly, without agenda, letting it tell you what it was before you decided what to do with it. It was good land, better than the price had suggested. The timber was mature, but not overripe. Another decade of growth before any responsible harvest, which suited her timeline. The creek ran through the eastern third of it, clear and purposeful. There was a natural clearing near the center, where the canopy broke, and the light came through in that same long column way she had noticed when she first rode into the settlement, and she stood in it a long moment with her face tilted up. Through the break in the redwoods, the sky was the particular deep blue of a California afternoon in good country. She thought, without warning, of her father walking the Sacramento land for the first time. She had been 7 years old, and he had carried her on his shoulders so she could see above the tall grass, and he had said, "Tell me what you see, Clara girl." She had told him, every detail, the way he had taught her. "Good," he had said. "Now tell me what you feel." She had thought about it seriously, the way children do when they understand a question is real. Like it's ours," she had said. "That's the one," he had said. "That's exactly the one." She stood in that clearing for a long time, and for the first time since she had loaded Absalom and pointed herself north, the tightness she had been carrying in her chest, the tightness she had carried so long she had stopped identifying it as tightness and had simply accepted it as the shape of her interior, loosened just slightly, not gone, but loosened. Above her, through the cathedral break of the redwoods, a single hawk turned slow circles in the blue, the mountains still watching Clara girl. She exhaled, and somewhere back in the settlement, without her knowledge, Elias Ward was sitting at the Aldridge supper table with a leather satchel at his feet and a letter in his breast pocket, a letter with a return address in San Francisco that had nothing whatsoever to do with cattle, and was staring at the door through which, in approximately 40 minutes, Clara DeVane would walk for the second time. He was not thinking about the letter. It started with the hands. Clara noticed them 3 days after the creek. She was at the trading post, going through Gideon Marsh's inventory of seed stock, with the focused attention of a woman who understood that the difference between the right seed and the wrong seed was the difference between a productive season and an expensive lesson. Elias Ward came in behind her, exchanged a few words with Gideon about a delivery he was expecting, art and set both hands flat on the counter while he waited for Gideon to check his ledger. Clara was not looking at him, but she saw the hands. They were not a cattle broker's hands. She knew cattle broker's hands. She had shaken enough of them in Sacramento. The hands of men who spent their working lives on horseback and in stock pens, moving animals, handling rope and leather, and the rough economy of livestock work. Those hands had a particular quality, weathered in specific places, thickened at the palm, the kind of wear that accumulated over years of one particular kind of work and could not be faked or borrowed. Elias Ward's hands were not those hands. They were working hands. She would not deny that. There was nothing soft or indoor about them. But the wear was wrong. The calluses were in the wrong places. The right hand in particular had a pattern of wear along the outer edge, and the first two fingers that she could not immediately account for, but that nagged at her, the way an unresolved column in a ledger nagged, quietly, persistently, refusing to be ignored. She filed it away. She did not look up from the seed stock. The second thing was the books. She would not have known about them except that Margaret Aldridge mentioned them in the passing, offhand way that people in small settlements mention things they consider unremarkable, but that are, in fact, telling. She was describing the room Elias boarded. A good room faces east, gets the morning light. And she said, without emphasis, and that she had needed to bring in an extra shelf for his books, because the man travelled with more reading material than most people owned outright. "What kind of books?" Clara asked, in the tone of a woman making conversation. Margaret thought about it. Law books, some of them. History. Some I couldn't make the titles of. Heavy things, not novels. Clara said. A cattle broker who travelled with a library of law books and history texts was not impossible. People were complicated. She knew that. But it added to the column she was keeping in the back of her mind. The column that did not yet have a heading, but was accumulating entries with the quiet diligence of a ledger that intended, eventually, to balance. The third thing was the way he listened. She observed this at the Aldridge table, which had become, without anyone formally deciding it, the social centre of Redwood Flats. Margaret fed people and people came, and around that table the settlement's conversations happened in the way that important conversations have always happened, not in meeting halls or formal arrangements, but over food, in the presence of someone who made you feel that eating and talking were both worth doing properly. Elias Ward came to supper most evenings when he was not out on the Heller property, or one of the other ranches he claimed to be assessing. He was quiet at the table in the way that Clara had initially read as reserve, the self-containment of a private man. But watching him more carefully over the course of several evenings, she began to revise that reading. He was not quiet because he was private, and he was quiet because he was listening, and not listening in the polite, performative way of a man waiting for his turn to speak. Listening with the focused, cataloguing attention of someone who was specifically trying to understand how a place worked, its economics, its frictions, its needs, the gap between what people said they needed and what they actually needed. She recognized that kind of listening because she did it herself, but she did it because she was a woman building something from nothing in a place that was new to her, and that kind of listening was a practical survival skill. She could not immediately account for why a cattle broker passing through a small timber settlement would need to understand it that deeply. She added it to the column. She did not speak to him directly again until the end of that first week, when the settlement held what Gideon Marsh called with the slight irony of a man who had seen genuine cities, the social. It was, in practice, a bonfire at the edge of the clearing on a Friday evening, with Cal Aldridge's fiddle and someone's inexhaustible supply of cider and the particular loosening of a small community that had worked hard all week and earned the right to be easy with each other for a few hours. Clara went because not going would have been a statement, and she was not ready to make statements yet about what kind of person she intended to be in Redwood Flats. She stood at a comfortable distance from the fire with a cup of cider she was drinking slowly, watching the settlement be itself, in which was always the most efficient way to understand a place. Elias Ward materialized beside her with the unhurried quality of a man who had decided to be somewhere and saw no reason to make a production of the decision. "You're doing it again," he said. She looked at him. "Cataloguing," he said. "You were doing it at the creek. You're doing it now." Clara considered denying it, then considered that denying it to a man who was clearly doing the same thing would be both dishonest and transparent. "Habit," she said. "New place." He said. And then, after a moment, "Sacramento Valley habit or something older?" "My father's habit," she said. "He said you could learn more about a place in 1 hour of watching than in 3 days of asking." Smart man. He was, she said, and the past tense landed between them, and he did not flinch from it or hurry past it with the uncomfortable, verbal shuffling that most people deployed around other people's grief. He simply received it, the way you receive information that matters. "How long?" he asked. 5 years, she said. He nodded. Once. The same kind of nod Gideon Marsh had given her on the first day. The nod that meant something real was being acknowledged. "I'm sorry," he said. And it was the plainest, most undecorated condolence she had ever received, and somehow that made it the most adequate one. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the fire. "Your mother?" she asked. She was not sure why she asked. She did not normally ask. Something shifted in his face, that same brief reorganization she had seen at the creek, the expression of a man deciding what to let show. "Alive," he said. "San Francisco. You're a long way from San Francisco for a cattle assessment." A pause, fractionally longer than it needed to be. "The work takes me where it takes me," he said. Clara looked at him steadily. "Does it?" It was not a question, and they both knew it was not a question. It was a marker, a small, precise flag planted in the ground between them that said, "I have noticed. I am not pressing, but I have noticed." He looked at her with that direct attention again, the look that dropped the careful lateral angle. And this time, the thing she could not name in his expression was closer to the surface. Something that looked, if she was being precise about it, like relief, like a man who had been waiting for someone to notice and had not been sure they would. "The work," he said again, more quietly, "takes me where it takes me." Clara looked back at the fire. She said, and let it rest there. She walked home that night turning the column over in her mind, not with suspicion exactly. Suspicion was too hot an emotion for what this was. It was something cooler, more deliberate. The particular alertness of a woman who had learned, through the specific education of being a woman alone managing significant things in a world that did not always mean her well, that the gap between what a person presented and what a person was deserved careful attention. Elias Ward was not dangerous. She was fairly certain of that. Not certain in the naive way of a woman who had not learned to read men, but certain in the way of someone who had, and whose reading was landing clearly. Whatever he was concealing, It was not something that threatened her, but it was something. And the something was beginning to matter to her in a way she had not authorized it to matter. That was the part that required attention. She sat on her porch that night longer than usual, in the dark, listening to the creak and the last of the fiddle music drifting from the direction of the bonfire. Her father's voice came to her the way it sometimes did in the quiet, not painfully, the way it had come in the first years after his death, but gently, like a hand on the shoulder. "Tell me what you feel, Clara girl." She thought about it seriously, the way he had taught her. What she felt was this: for the first time in 5 years, she was genuinely curious about another person. Not curious about their land or their yield, or whether their word was good. Curious about the interior of them. Curious about the gap between what showed and what didn't. Curious about a question that had been left unanswered at a creek bank a week ago, and that she had not stopped thinking about since. Though she had made a reasonable effort to stop thinking about it, she did not know what to do with that. She had forgotten, if she had ever properly known, what you were supposed to do when curiosity of that particular kind arrived uninvited and showed no signs of leaving. Above her, through the redwoods, the stars were sharp and numerous in the high country dark. One of them, for just a moment, seemed to brighten. Clara looked at it for a long time. Then she went inside, and she did not, for once, think about the column. She thought about the question he had not answered. And for the first time, she thought about it without the cool, analytical remove she had been using to manage it. She thought about it the way you think about something that has gotten inside you before you thought to close the door. The letter fell out on a Thursday. Not dramatically. Not in the way of stories where important things are discovered through clever investigation or the satisfying mechanics of a well-laid plot. It fell out the way important things actually tend to surface in real life. Through accident, through the simple indifferent physics of a leather satchel set down too quickly on a trading post counter, its brass clasp insufficiently secured, its contents briefly and partially surrendering to gravity before Elias Ward caught the satchel and gathered everything back with the quick, practiced motion of a man who had made this mistake before and had a system for correcting it. Clara was there because she was always at the trading post on Thursdays. She was 3 feet away. She saw the letter. Not all of it. The satchel was recovered in seconds, and the letter went back inside, and the clasp was secured, and Elias straightened, and the whole thing was over before it had properly begun. But 3 feet was close enough, and the letter had fallen face up, and Clara had her father's eyes, the kind that absorbed and retained without appearing to do either. And what she retained was this: the return address in the upper left corner of the envelope. Ward and Associates, Commercial Law, Montgomery Street, San Francisco. She did not react. This was not difficult. She had been not reacting to things her entire adult life. It was arguably her most developed skill. She looked back at the seed catalogue she had been reviewing, turned a page with the calm of a woman whose interior had not just rearranged itself, and finished her business with Gideon Marsh at a pace that suggested absolutely nothing had happened. Elias exchanged a few words with Gideon, picked up his delivery, a wrapped parcel she now understood had nothing to do with cattle, and left. Clara waited until the door closed. "Gideon," she said, in the same tone she used for everything. Said Gideon, who was already writing in his ledger. "Ward and Associates, commercial law firm, on Montgomery Street." Gideon's pen did not stop moving. He said again. "You knew," she said. Gideon set his pen down, looked at her with the particular expression of a man who'd been waiting for a specific conversation and had prepared for it accordingly. "I had a notion," he said. "How long?" "Second week he was here. Man asks too many questions about timber rights and water access and county land registration for someone who's only interested in cattle." "And you didn't think to mention it?" "Not my business to mention it," Gideon said. "Man hasn't done anything wrong, hasn't misrepresented himself to anyone in a way that's cost them anything, hasn't taken anything that wasn't offered." He picked his pen back up. Seemed like something that'd work itself out. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You could have told me," she said, and she heard, to her own mild irritation, that there was something in her voice beyond the practical, something that had gotten in without her permission. Gideon heard it too. She could tell, because he did not look up from his ledger, which was his version of tact. "I suppose I could have," he said, "but then you'd have had it from me instead of from him. And I think," he said, turning a page, "that the second version is going to be considerably more interesting." She found Elias Ward at the creek. Of course she did. It was where they had started, and apparently where things between them came back to settle, the way water finds its own level. He was not crouched this time. He was sitting on a flat rock at the water's edge, with his forearms on his knees, looking at the current, and the leather satchel was beside him, and the composed stillness was in place, and he looked, from 20 feet away, exactly like what he had always presented himself as, a quiet, self-contained man, with nothing particular on his mind. She knew better now. She sat down on the rock beside him without asking. He looked at her, read her face with that quick, accurate assessment she had come to recognize, and whatever he found there told him what he needed to know, because he did not say anything immediately. He looked back at the creek and was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man organizing something he had known he would eventually need to say. "The satchel," he said. "The letter," she said. "How much did you see?" "Enough," she said. "Ward and Associates, Commercial Law, Montgomery Street." He exhaled, not with the drama of a man caught, with the quieter exhalation of a man who has been carrying something for a while and has just set it down. "My father's firm," he said. "Mine now, technically. I took the bar in 71. Clara looked at the water. "So there's no cattle assessment," she said. "There's some cattle," he said. "I do actually know cattle. I grew up with cattle. But that's not why you're here." "No," he said. "That's not why I'm here." The creek moved between them and the silence and the truth that was about to occupy it. "Then why?" Clara said. Not with anger. With the straightforward directness of a woman who had decided she was owed a straightforward answer and intended to collect it, he told her. Not all at once. It came out in the measured, considered way of a man who was deciding, as he spoke, how much of the truth to give and in what order, which was itself a lawyerly habit, and would have been irritating if the truth he was delivering had not been, incrementally, genuinely surprising. His father, the founding ward of Ward and Associates, had died 8 months earlier, left him the firm, the Montgomery Street office, a considerable amount of money, and a mandate written into the will with the specific language of a man who had spent his life drafting documents that could not be argued with, to assess the viability of the Northern California timber corridor for commercial development. Not exploitative development. The elder ward had been particular about that, had written the parameters carefully, but sustainable, community-centered development, the kind that built settlements rather than stripped them. He believed, Elias said, that the next 20 years in California were were going to be determined by what happened in the timber country, whether it got taken apart by the large operators or whether it got built into something that lasted. And he sent you to find out which way it was going, Clara said. He asked me to find out, Elias said. There's a difference. He died before I could tell him he was asking the wrong person. Why the wrong person? He was quiet for a moment. Because I'm a lawyer, he said. I know how to assess a contract. I know how to read a land registration and identify a fraudulent timber rights claim and tell you whether a county ordinance will hold up against a challenge from a San Francisco operator with money and patience. He paused. What I don't know is people, what they need, what they're actually building versus what they think they're building, whether a place has the kind of roots that will hold when the pressure comes. So you came as a cattle broker, Clara said, to find out what you couldn't find out as a lawyer. To listen, he said, the way you listen, without the thing you are getting in the way of what you hear. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's either very intelligent, she said, or very dishonest. I've been trying to decide which, he said, since about the third day. And he looked at her directly. That look again, the one that dropped all the careful management and just looked. Both, he said. I think it was both. And I think I knew that, and did it anyway, which is its own answer about my character that I'm not entirely comfortable with. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the creek. My father, she said, used to say that the difference between a dishonest man and an honest man who made a dishonest choice was what they did when the choice caught up with them. Elias said nothing. You could have kept the satchel closed, she said. You could have let me not see it. You could have managed it. I know, he said. But you're here, she said. I'm here, he said. The creek ran between them in the afternoon light, clear and purposeful, the way it ran through the eastern third of her land parcel, the land she had bought sight unseen and walked on her first full day here, and stood in the clearing of and felt, for the first time in 5 years, something other than grief. She thought about that clearing now, the hawk turning slow circles in the blue. What does your assessment say, she said so far, about Redwood Flats? He considered it seriously. It says, he said slowly, that this settlement has something most places don't. People who came here because they wanted to build something real, not because they were running from something failed. That's rarer than it should be. A pause. It says the timber rights situation in this county is going to get complicated within 5 years when the San Francisco operators start moving north, and the people here are going to need someone who can read those moves before they happen. And the people themselves, Clara said. What does it say about them? He was quiet for a long moment. It says, he said, and his voice was slightly different now, quieter, more careful, the voice of a man navigating genuinely unfamiliar ground, that there is at least one person here who is building something I don't have a legal framework for, something that isn't in any document I've been trained to read. Clara looked at the water. She did not ask him what he meant. She knew what he meant, and he knew she knew. And the creek moved through the afternoon light between them, and neither of them said anything more for a long time. And it was the most honest conversation Clara DeVane had participated in since her father died. That evening, she sat on her porch and did not catalogue anything. She did not keep a column, and she did not assess or inventory, or apply the cool, analytical remove that had served her so reliably for 5 years as a substitute for the warmer things she had not known how to let back in. She just sat, The stars came through above the redwoods in the high country, dark, sharp, and unhurried, and the creek ran in the middle distance. And somewhere in the settlement a door closed softly, and footsteps moved on a dirt road, and then were quiet. Her father's voice did not come to her tonight. It didn't need to. She already knew what she felt. She looked up at the stars for a long time, and one of them, the same one she was fairly certain, the same one as before, brightened. Just briefly, just enough. "All right, Daddy," she said very quietly, to no one and to exactly the right person. All right. She did not see him for 3 days after the creek. This was not avoidance, or not entirely avoidance. She had work to do. The timber parcel needed a proper boundary survey before she could begin the conversations with the county land office that would establish her rights before the San Francisco operators Elias had mentioned started moving north. She had seeds to get into the ground in the clearing where the canopy broke, and the light came through in long columns. She had a roof seam on the south side of the cabin that was going to become a problem in the first hard rain if she did not address it now while the weather was still cooperative. She had always been good at having work to do. What was different in these 3 days was that she was aware of it, aware of herself deploying work the way she had always deployed it. As a structure, a container, a thing to fill the hours that might otherwise ask her questions she wasn't ready to answer. She had done this for 5 years without noticing she was doing it. The noticing was new. And the noticing was, she understood, a direct consequence of a conversation at a creek with a man who had sat beside her on a flat rock and told her the truth when he did not have to. Awareness, she was discovering, was considerably less comfortable than its absence. On the 4th day, Gideon Marsh told her, in the passing way, he told her things that were not passing at all, that Elias Ward had been to see him about extending his board at the Aldridge house. Extending it how long? Clara said. Didn't specify, Gideon said. It's like turning pages in his ledger. Said he had some additional work to do in the area. Assessment was taking longer than anticipated. Clara looked at a shelf of dry goods for a moment. What kind of work? She said. Didn't specify that either, Gideon said. And then, after a pause timed with the precision of a man who had been deploying pauses strategically for 6 decades, asked me, though, whether there was anyone in the settlement who might need legal counsel regarding timber rights registration before the county office updates its roles in the fall. Clara was quiet. Did he? She said. He did, said Gideon, and turned another page. I told him I'd think on it. And have you? I have, he said. I think there might be one person. He did not look up from the ledger. Clara picked up her dry goods. You are a deeply irritating man, Gideon Marsh, she said, without heat. I've been told, he said. Have a good afternoon, Miss DeVane. She went to the Aldridge house that evening. Not at supper time. She was not ready to have this witnessed by Margaret Aldridge's attentive eyes and Cal's slow, satisfied smile and the assembled population of Redwood Flats, all of whom had clearly been following the development of this situation with the focused interest of people who did not have enough theatre in their lives. She went at 7, when the supper things would be cleared and the household would be settling into its evening, and she knocked on the door with the direct knock of a woman who had decided to do something and was doing it before she could construct a sufficient argument against it. Margaret opened the door. I looked at her and produced the expression of a woman who had been expecting exactly this knock for approximately 2 weeks. He's on the back porch, she said, and held the door open. Thank you, Margaret, Clara said. said Margaret, in a tone that contained an entire editorial. The back porch of the Aldridge house faced east, toward the tree line and the creek beyond it, and in the evening the light came through the redwoods at a low angle that turned everything it touched a deep saturated gold. Elias was sitting in a wooden chair with a book open in his lap. One of the heavy ones, she assumed, a law or history, or something that did not have the decency to be a novel. And he looked up when she came through the door with the expression of a man who was not entirely surprised, but was not going to pretend he had been certain. Good, she thought. She did not want certainty. Certainty was the province of people who had not been paying attention. "Mr. Vane," he said. "Mr. Ward," she said. And then, "That seems a little formal at this point." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Clara," he said. "Elias," she said. She sat down in the other chair. There were two, facing east, as though the porch had been designed for exactly this configuration, and looked out at the tree line for a moment, organizing what she had come to say in the way she organized everything from the most structural element down. I understand," she said, "that you've extended your board." "I have," he said. "And that you've been asking Gideon about legal counsel needs regarding timber rights." "I have," he said again. "Is that the assessment talking?" she said. "Or something else?" He was quiet for a moment. The book closed in his lap without him looking at it. "The assessment," he said carefully, "is finished." Clara looked at the tree line. "Then it's something else," she said. "Yes," he said. "It's something else." The evening light moved through the redwoods in long gold columns, and the creek was audible in the middle distance, and somewhere above them a bird made one clear note, and then was quiet, as though it had said the one thing it had come to say and considered its work complete. "I owe you a more complete accounting," Elias said, "than what I gave you at the creek." "You don't owe me anything," Clara said. "You told me what was true. That's more than most people manage." "I told you the facts," he said. "That's not always the same thing." She looked at him. "Then tell me the rest," she said. The rest came out the way the first part had, measured, considered, a lawyer's instinct for structure even in personal disclosure. But underneath the structure, this time, she could hear something that had not been audible at the creek, something unguarded, the sound of a man speaking from a place he did not usually speak from. He told her that his father had died with more regret than money, which was saying something because the money was considerable. That the firm and the mandate and the Northern California assessment had been, and in the elder Ward's own words in the will, the work I should have done 20 years ago instead of the work that paid. That Elias had come north not only to fulfill the mandate, but because the alternative was sitting in a Montgomery Street office, inheriting a life that fit him the way a suit fits a man who did not choose it. "And Redwood Flats," Clara said. "Redwood Flats," he said, "is the first place I've been in a considerable amount of time that has felt like something I might have chosen." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a large thing to say about a settlement with 30 people and one trading post," she said. "It's not entirely about the settlement," he said. The evening light deepened around them. The gold going amber, going the particular dark copper of dusk in timber country, and the first stars beginning to suggest themselves in the east above the tree line, faint and preliminary, the way they came through in the hour before full dark. Clara looked at them, thought about her father, not with the grief, or not only with the grief, with something else alongside it now, something that had been growing in the clearing of her chest since the night she had looked up at the stars from this very settlement and felt the tightness loosen for the first time. "My father," she said. Used to say there was a right magic one. Elias looked at her. He meant love, she said. He was talking to me about love. I was 9 years old, and he said it had to be the right magic one, or it wasn't worth the trouble. She paused. I spent a long time thinking that was the most impractical thing he ever said, and coming from a man who was the most practical person I knew. And now, Elias said. And now, Clara said. I think maybe he was being precise. Not romantic, precise. She looked at the stars. I think he meant that the right one wasn't a category or a standard or a list of qualities you decided on in advance. I think he meant it was specific, singular, the kind of thing you couldn't engineer or arrange or find by looking. She turned and looked at Elias directly. I think he meant it found you, she said, when you stopped trying to outthink it. Elias held her gaze, and the composed stillness of his face, that careful, managed stillness she had been reading since the first morning at the creek, came down. Not dramatically. The way things come down when the effort of holding them up is no longer necessary, act simply and completely, like a curtain drawn back from a window that had always had good light on the other side of it. What was underneath was not complicated. It was just a man, looking at a woman, with the full, unmanaged attention of someone who had found something he had not known he was looking for and was not going to pretend otherwise. Your father, he said quietly, was a very wise man. He was, she said, and she smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the smile of a woman who had kept her interior carefully ordered for 5 years and was choosing, deliberately and without fanfare, to set a few things down. The smile of someone who had ridden north on a practical decision and arrived somewhere that turned out to be something else entirely. The smile of a woman who had come for water and found considerably more, and they sat on that porch until full dark, talking in the way that two self-contained people talk when they have decided to stop being quite so self-contained, carefully at first, then less carefully, then not carefully at all. About his father and her father, about the firm and the farm and the 5 years she had spent paying down a lien, and the years he had spent paying down a different kind of debt, about the timber country and what it might become, and what they each, separately, and now perhaps not so separately, intended to build in it. Margaret Aldridge, Clara was quite certain, was listening from inside the house. She found she did not mind. She walked home alone through the settlement in the full dark, through the smell of pine resin and creek water and the last of someone's cook fire, and she stopped on her porch and looked up at the sky the way she had been looking up at it since she was a small girl being told why the stars twinkled. They were brilliant tonight, the kind of brilliant that happened in high country when the air was clean and the dark was complete, and nothing came between you and the light that had been traveling toward you from an unimaginable distance for longer than you had been alive. She stood there a long time. I know, Daddy, she said. I know. And somewhere in the eastern sky, above the redwoods, above the timber country, above the California frontier in the year of 1873, a star brightened, just briefly, just enough. The mountain was still watching, and for the first time in 5 years, Clara DeVane went inside without the weight, and it had been there so long she had forgotten what it felt like without it. She remembered now. Some things cannot be forced, cannot be engineered or arranged or found by deciding in advance what shape they will take. The right job, the right place, the right person, they find you when you are busy building something real, when you have stopped performing the search and started living the life, when you arrive at a creek at 6 a.m. for no reason more complicated than that you need water, and discover without planning to, that something has been waiting there for you all along. Clara DeVane came to Redwood Flats to save herself. She did not expect to be found. That is, of course, precisely why she was. The right love doesn't arrive on your schedule. It arrives when you finally built something worth arriving to.